France had killed the beast. At least that was the official story. A massive wolf had been shot by the king's own hunter. Survivors reportedly recognised it. The hunter was rewarded. The animal was carried toward Versailles, and France could finally celebrate. There was just one problem. The killings started again. Between 1764 and 1767, people across the rural region of Gevaudan were attacked by an animal, or perhaps several animals, that became known simply as the Beast. The victims were real, so was the fear, but around those attacks grew something much larger. Sensational newspaper reports, enormous hunts, royal intervention, and a government that badly needed a victory. This case file is not about proving the beast was a werewolf or some unknown monster. It is asking a more revealing question. Did France really identify the killer, or did the Crown close the case because it needed the beast to be dead? Because once the king turns an animal hunt into a test of royal authority, admitting the animal is still out there becomes more than an embarrassment. It becomes proof that the king has failed. The first officially recorded death came on June 30, 1764. 14-year-old Jeanne Boulet had been tending livestock near the village of Les Zubac when she was killed. Her burial record did not mention a supernatural monster. It referred to a ferocious animal. But Jeanne was not the last. More attacks followed across Gevaudan, a poor and isolated region of mountains, forests, and grazing land in south-central France. Many of the victims were women and children, tending cattle or sheep. Some survived with terrible injuries, others were partially eaten. The exact numbers are disputed. 18th century records are incomplete, later lists disagree. And not every wolf attack in the region can confidently be linked to the same animal. Depending on the reconstruction, somewhere between roughly 80 and more than 100 people may have been killed, with many more injured. Those numbers matter. Questioning the more dramatic parts of the story does not mean the danger itself was invented. France had a real history of wolf attacks. Researchers have documented thousands of reported deaths across several centuries. Children regularly work near forests and grazing land, placing them directly in a predator's environment. But the Gevaudan attacks seemed unusually frequent, unusually persistent, and unusually bold. Witnesses often described an animal larger and more powerful than a normal wolf. Some remembered reddish fur, a dark stripe along its back, a broad head, or a long tail. The descriptions did not always agree. That is not surprising. Most sightings happened during sudden, violent attacks. Some witnesses were children. Many only saw the animal for seconds. But where the evidence became uncertain, imagination stepped in. Soon, people were no longer talking about attacks by wolves. They were talking about the beast, and once the animal had a name, a local crisis was ready to become a national story. In 1764, France had only recently emerged from the 7 Years' War. For years, newspapers had been filled with battles, alliances, and military defeats. Once the war ended, editors needed fresh stories capable of holding public attention. The attacks in Gevaudan arrived at the perfect time. François Moranis, editor of the Courrier d'Avignon, was early to recognise the story's potential. His reports described Gevaudan almost as though it were another battlefield. The language became more dramatic. The animal was compared with creatures from legend. Some reports suggested an unknown or exotic predator. Engravings gave the beast a different body depending on the artist. Wolf-like in one image, spotted like a hyena in another, and almost mythical in the next. The story moved from Avignon to Paris and then beyond France. The farther it travelled from Gevaudan, the easier it became to turn conflicting local reports into one clean narrative. One region, one monster, one enemy. That was far more compelling than a messy series of attacks by different wolves. Once the public accepted the idea of one extraordinary beast, every new attack seemed to confirm it. Conflicting descriptions and distant locations could all be folded into the same legend. The press did not invent the victims, but it helped turn uncertain evidence into a character the public could recognise and fear. The beast was no longer just an animal somewhere in the countryside. It had become a national humiliation, and that meant the king could not ignore it for much longer. Louis XV was not dealing with a beast from a position of strength. France had suffered a disastrous defeat in the 7 Years' War. It had lost territory, spent enormous sums of money, and emerged with the crown's reputation badly damaged. The king was also criticised for taxation, royal excess, and appearing distant from the lives of ordinary people. Now newspapers were reporting that a monster was killing women and children while local authorities failed to stop it. For Louis XV, intervention offered an opportunity. The crown could appear decisive and protective. If the king's men succeeded where everyone else had failed, the hunt could become a small but very public victory. The king offered rewards. Soldiers and professional hunters joined the search. People who fought back against the animal were honoured. One of the most celebrated encounters involved a group of children led by Jacques Portefeuille. In January 1765, the children were attacked while tending cattle. Instead of scattering, they stayed together and fought back with sticks and improvised weapons until the animal retreated. Louis XV rewarded them, and Portefeuille was offered an education at the crown's expense. It was a powerful story. The children represented courage, the king represented protection, and the beast represented disorder, waiting to be defeated. But rewarding courage was the easy part. The crown still had to produce the one result everyone expected, a dead beast. And before the king's own hunter entered the case, France would discover just how difficult that was. The first major official hunt was led by Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel and soldiers from the Clermont Prince Dragoons. Duhamel treated the operation almost like a military campaign. Large groups of local people swept through the countryside while armed men waited for the animal to appear. But large hunts created large problems. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people made noise, confused tracks, and gave any predator plenty of warning. Locals did not always cooperate. Hunters argued over tactics. Wolves were killed. The attacks continued. Duhamel's own reputation became tangled up in the hunt. After France's military humiliation, killing the beast offered him a chance to recover some honour. Instead, every failure made the situation worse. The crown next turned to Jean-Charles d'Anville and his sons, professional wolf hunters from Normandy. They rejected Duhamel's huge military sweeps and preferred careful tracking, trained dogs, and patience. They failed too. By the summer of 1765, the beast, or whatever was being blamed as the beast, had survived soldiers, local hunts, and professional specialists. France had committed manpower, money, and royal attention, and people were still dying. Louis XV now sent Francois Antoine, a senior royal hunting officer and the man responsible for the king's firearms during hunts. This was not just another hunter arriving in Gevaudan. This was the crown taking direct ownership of the result. And when Antoine finally killed a very large wolf, everyone had reason to believe the case was over. On September 20, 1765, Francois Antoine took part in a hunt near the Abbey of Chaise. A large wolf appeared. Antoine fired and wounded it. When the animal continued moving, it was shot again and killed. The wolf was unusually large, reportedly weighing around 60 kilograms and measuring roughly 1.7 meters from nose to tail. Its body was examined. Its stomach reportedly contained animal remains, but nothing that proved it had eaten a human victim. Survivors were then brought forward, and several reportedly recognized scars or physical features they associated with the animal that had attacked them. But Antoine's own written conclusion was more cautious than the story that followed. He did not claim that the evidence had conclusively proven the wolf's guilt. He said he had never seen a wolf of comparable size and believed it could be the feared beast. Believed, not proven. For the royal court, that was enough. The wolf of Chaise was preserved and taken toward Versailles. Antoine was celebrated and rewarded. Printed images showed the king's hunter defeating the animal. The story spreading through France was simple. The king's man had succeeded. The beast was dead. Antoine remained in the region for several more weeks, killing another adult wolf and at least one younger animal. Then he returned to Paris. For a while, the attacks appeared to stop. France finally had its ending until December, when the evidence changed the story again. Reports of attacks returned. On December 2nd, an animal reportedly targeted two boys. The older boy protected the younger one and managed to drive it away. Other incidents followed. By 1766, people were again being killed in and around the same broad region associated with the beast. That creates a central problem in this case. If Antoine killed the one and only beast in September 1765, what was attacking people afterward? There are several possible answers. Antoine may have killed one dangerous wolf while another continued the attacks. There may have been several animals from the beginning. Some later incidents may have involved ordinary wolves that were automatically blamed on the famous beast, or the Wolf of Shades may not have been responsible for the earlier attacks at all. What the continued violence does not support is the neat royal version. One monster caused the terror. The king's hunter killed it. The crisis ended. That conclusion had been accepted before enough time had passed to test it, and when the animal attacks returned, Versailles did not launch another campaign on the same scale. The court had already celebrated its victory. Reopening the case would mean reopening the embarrassment. The people of Gevaudan were left facing a danger France had already declared defeated, but to understand why the official answer was so weak, we have to return to the question beneath the legend. Was there ever one beast at all? More than 2.5 centuries later, the evidence cannot identify one animal with confidence. But some explanations fit better than others. The most straightforward answer is wolves. Wolves lived throughout 18th century France. They sometimes attacked people and could become more dangerous during hunger, disease, or disruption to their habitat. Historian J. M. Smith argues that the physical evidence points towards a wolf, or more likely, wolves. That plural may explain much of the mystery. The attacks covered a large area and continued for nearly 3 years. Witness descriptions differed. Some incidents happened close together, but far apart geographically. Several large wolves were killed during the hunts, yet the violence continued. The belief that one animal caused every attack may have been the very assumption that made the case seem impossible. A wolf-dog hybrid has also been suggested. Such an animal might have combined a wolf's strength with less fear of humans, but the surviving records cannot prove it. The hyena theory is older than many people realise. Even 18th century writers debated whether an exotic predator might explain features they considered unusual, but hyena may sometimes have meant little more than, "This does not look like the wolves we know." The more elaborate theories, lions, trained animals, armour, murder conspiracies, and serial killers, depend on evidence that simply is not there, and the werewolf belongs to folklore, not this case file. The least dramatic answer is probably the strongest. Several attacks by one or more wolves were grouped together, magnified by fear and transformed by the press into one extraordinary monster. That does not make the story less interesting. It makes the official hunt more revealing. France may have spent months trying to kill one perfect villain when the real problem was too scattered and complicated to end with one heroic gunshot, and in 1767 a local hunter would give Gevaudan a very different ending from the one Versailles had already celebrated. By 1767 the attacks had continued for almost 3 years. Royal attention had faded, but the people of Gevaudan still had to live with the danger. The Marquis d'Epchay organised another local hunt. On June 19, a hunter named John Chastel shot and killed an animal later remembered as the final Beast of Gévaudan. Over time, the story became wrapped in legend. Some versions claim Chastel used silver bullets, others said he stopped to pray while the beast calmly waited for him. Those details appeared later. What matters here is simpler. After Chastel's kill, the famous sequence of attacks ended. That does not prove he killed the same animal responsible for every earlier death. It does not prove Antoine's wolf was innocent, and it does not prove there had only ever been one single beast. But the timing gave Gevaudan a different ending from the one announced by the crown. Versailles celebrated in 1765. The attacks ended in 1767. That 2-year gap is the problem the official story cannot neatly explain. So before we reach the verdict, I want to know what you think. When the attacks returned after the king's hunter had supposedly killed the beast, should France have publicly reopened the case? Or was it reasonable to assume that a different wolf was responsible? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy cases where the official story stops matching the evidence, give the video a like. It helps YouTube know that the wild ones want more investigations like this. Now, let us separate what the evidence actually supports from the ending France wanted. The claim one extraordinary beast caused the attacks. Francois Antoine killed it in September 1765, and the royal hunt entered the crisis. Evidence verdict? Busted. Antoine certainly killed an unusually large wolf. That wolf may have been responsible for some of the attacks, but there was no reliable way to connect one animal to every death across the region. Witness identifications were based on brief and terrifying encounters. Their descriptions did not always agree. The incidents covered a wide area and continued over several years. Most importantly, the attacks resumed after the Wolf of Chaise was dead. The evidence does not support the complete royal ending. One beast, one kill, case closed. The more likely explanation is that several wolves, or at least several animals, were involved and later merged into one famous monster. Antoine may have killed a beast. The evidence cannot confirm that he killed the beast, and France announced victory before the danger had truly passed. The Beast of Gévaudan is usually framed as a mystery about animal identity. Wolf, hyena, hybrid, something unknown, but the deeper story is about what happens when uncertainty becomes politically inconvenient. The attacks began as a local tragedy. Newspapers turned them into a national spectacle. Different sightings and deaths became the work of one named enemy. Then the crown tied its reputation to defeating that enemy. From that point on, the hunt needed a particular kind of ending. It needed the carcass, it needed the hero, and it needed the king's intervention to succeed. Francois Antoine supplied all three. A large wolf lay dead. Survivors identified it. Printed images carried the victory across France. Rewards were paid. Reputations were repaired. And Versailles moved on. Then more people were attacked. The crown's failure was not necessarily that Antoine killed the wrong wolf. We cannot know that. The real failure was turning a reasonable belief into an official certainty before the evidence justified it. The Wolf of Chaise fit the story France needed. The later attacks did not. And once the victory had been announced, preserving the ending mattered more than admitting the case was still open. The beast was real, but perhaps not in the way history remembers it. It may never have been one impossible creature. It may have been several predators, frightened witnesses, ambitious newspapers, and a monarchy desperate to show that it was still in control, all compressed into one animal-shaped enemy. France declared the beast dead. The killings continued, and that is why the real mystery is not simply what attacked Gevaudan. It is why the verdict arrived before the evidence was finished. Receipts first, verdict later. And if you think France's beast case was disturbing, wait until you see what happened when a circus elephant killed a man and a crowd demanded justice. Mary's case asks whether she was punished for her death or turned into a public spectacle.